The house is already burning when she runs back in. Not towards safety. Toward the far end of a hallway that is orange at the middle and black at the top. Toward a room she had walked away from 20 minutes ago because he told her to go back to sleep, and she had believed him. Nashville, 2:47 in the morning. A neighborhood of sleeping porches and motion sensor lights, beginning to click on one by one. A woman already outside, already safe, already on the phone with the dispatcher who is telling her to stay where she is. She goes back in anyway, because someone is still inside, because 60 feet of burning hallway stands between her and a guest room door she cannot stop looking at, because she already knows, before she crosses the threshold, before the heat finds the left side of her face, that walking back out without him is not a thing she is capable of. The door closes behind her. The neighborhood watches the fire. No one follows her in. The night Vanessa Brooks burned was the night she proved she loved Terry Coleman more than she loved her own face. She didn't know that yet. Standing in the front yard at 2 a.m, lungs scraping against the cold air, watching orange light pour through the windows of the house they'd spent 3 years filling with furniture and arguments and plans, she wasn't thinking about love. She was thinking about the guest room, at the far end of the hallway, past the section of wall that had already caught. Terry was in that room. She'd watched him walk in there 2 hours ago, one hand dragging along the wall for balance, shoes still on, suit jacket twisted sideways, because he'd stopped caring about the jacket somewhere around his 4th drink. She'd followed him far enough to confirm he'd made it to the bed. He'd been face down by the time she'd pulled the door halfway closed and walked back to their room at the other end of the hall. The other end, which was the part she kept returning to. Standing in the yard, smoke thickening, neighbors starting to appear on porches in whatever they'd grabbed on the way out. The other end of the hallway, 60 feet she'd walked 1,000 times in socks, in heels, carrying laundry, carrying coffee, 60 feet that now had fire somewhere in the middle. The 911 dispatcher was still talking in her ear. "Stay outside, ma'am. Can you confirm your address?" She confirmed it. Because she knew the address. Because she'd signed the mortgage documents 18 months ago and written that address on every piece of mail that mattered. And she kept watching the house. And she kept not seeing Terry come out. A neighbor, the man from 3 houses down whose name she could never remember, who mowed his lawn at 7 on Saturday mornings, without apology shouted from the sidewalk. "He's not out?" Vanessa didn't answer. She was doing math she didn't want to do. The kind of math where the answer was already written, and she was just trying to find the error. Terry was drunk. Terry was at the far end. Terry slept through every alarm she'd ever set. Their wedding anniversary. Doctor appointments. That one morning last spring when she'd stood at the bedroom door in her coat, keys in hand, waiting, and finally left alone, because she needed the job more than she needed the argument. The firefighters were on the way. She went back in. Not after a speech. Not after weighing anything against anything else. 1 second she was standing on the grass with dew coming through the thin fabric of her socks, and the next second her hand was on the front door. Because the calculation wasn't a calculation. Because he was still inside, and there was no version of herself that could remain in the yard while that was true. The hallway was black at the top and orange at the middle. She stayed low. That part she knew from some distant fire safety memory school, maybe, or a pamphlet she'd half read and half detested. Low. She moved low, called his name and the smoke swallowed it. Called again, moved faster. The heat on the left side of her body arrived without warning. Not a gradual warming. A wall. As if the air had changed its mind about temperature entirely, and simply became something else. Her face, her neck, the skin along her left arm, all of it registered the change before her brain made sense of it. She kept moving. The guest room door was closed. She pushed it open and found him exactly where she'd feared, on the floor beside the bed, face turned sideways, one arm stretched toward nowhere. Unconscious. Not the staged unconsciousness of someone who drifted off the real kind. Heavy and complete. "Terry," she shook him. "Nothing. Terry, wake up." His shoulder moved under her hand, but his eyes didn't. She couldn't lift him. She knew that immediately and without ego. He had 6 inches and 60 pounds on her, and she'd just crossed a burning hallway, and her left arm was beginning to report information she wasn't ready to process. She got behind him, knelt, worked her arms under his, and locked her hands across his chest, pulled. His weight was enormous. Not because he was so heavy in ordinary life, but because unconscious weight is different distributed wrong, uncooperative, refusing to organize itself in any way that helps. His shoes dragged. His head tipped back against her shoulder. She pulled again. 3 feet. Stop. Breathe through the collar of her shirt. Pull. 2 more feet. The hallway was worse on the way back. The wall to her left had gone fully by the time she reached the middle stretch, and the heat on that side wasn't a wall anymore. It was a presence, insistent and personal, leaning into the exposed skin of her face and arm, with something that felt almost like intention. She didn't let go, because letting go was the only thing she'd decided against before she came in, and everything else was just pain. She pulled Terry Coleman across the threshold by his armpits, while flames painted the wall behind her, and she did not stop until his heels cleared the front step and she could see the grass. Then she let go and went down beside him, because her legs had been waiting for permission. The paramedics found him breathing. The paramedics found her burning. Vanessa Brooks had worked at Everly Beauty on West End Avenue for 4 years by the time Terry Coleman walked into her life, and she'd understood the currency of her appearance long before he arrived. Not in the bitter way that comes from being underestimated, in the specific, practical way that comes from being paid for it. Campaigns, product features, hands wrapped around serums and foundations, face tilted toward lights, positioned to make her look like the best possible version of herself, which photographers always framed as natural beauty, and which Vanessa knew was actually geometry, technique, patience. She was good at the technique part. She was better at the knowledge part. That was what Renee Young recognized first, before any of the rest of it. Would you treat them with kindness? Renee had managed the Everly Beauty Nashville location since before Vanessa applied, and she'd hired Vanessa not because of the photographs but because of the way Vanessa talked about formulation during the interview, the actual chemistry of things, the difference between humectants and occlusives, the specific reasons a product that worked for one skin type would wreck another. "Half my girls can tell you what's on the shelf," Renee had said. "You can tell me why it's there." Vanessa loved the why of it. Would you treat them with kindness? She loved standing with a customer who'd wasted $60 on the wrong moisturizer and working backward through their routine until she could locate the error. Would you treat them with kindness? She loved the consultation counter on Saturday afternoons when the store filled with who wanted to feel better about their faces, and she loved being the person who could actually help them do that rather than simply validating whatever they'd already decided to buy. The modeling part of the job, the campaigns, the in-store advertising, the feature photographs was additional and welcome and useful for income, but was not, in her private accounting, the core of who she was at that counter. Terry Coleman arrived during a campaign. His company, Crestline Brand Group, handled Everly Beauty's regional advertising out of a downtown Nashville office, and he came to the store on a Thursday morning to oversee the production setup. This was not unusual. Marketing representatives came and went, checked sight lines and lighting and product placement, spoke mostly to Renee left. Terry stayed. Not obtrusively. He found places to be that were adjacent to where Vanessa was working, without being directly in front of her, which she noticed because she was perceptive, and because the adjacency kept shifting location. By the 3rd position she'd catalogued, she'd made a decision about what was happening, and by the 4th, she'd decided it wasn't unwelcome. He introduced himself at the end of the session. Clean-handed, direct, no performance of casualness. He said he ran the agency. She said she knew. He said the shots had looked excellent. She said the product was good, which was the real reason. He smiled at that, and she let him keep the smile. He came back the following Tuesday. The campaign was finished. He had reasons questions for Renee, product clarifications, follow-up items that Vanessa later understood were largely constructed, but he had them, and they were convincingly specific. And he stayed long enough to ask her to dinner and convincingly specific enough that when she said yes, she felt like she was choosing rather than being maneuvered. She was being both, but she'd learned to appreciate the former even when the latter was also true. 3 months in, she stopped counting his visits. 6 months in, she'd met his parents Pamela and Harold Coleman, Cascade Hills, Tuesday dinners, china that never varied, regardless of what was being served. Patricia and Leonard. She'd thought at the time that the formality of those evenings was a Coleman family trait, something inherited and simply present. It took longer to understand that what it actually reflected was a set of values about presentation, about what things looked like from the outside, and how that appearance related to worth. She and Terry married 2 years after the Thursday campaign. Church in Inglewood, reception in a rented space on the river, Vanessa's father, Daniel Brooks, making one toast that he'd clearly been practicing for weeks, and her mother Shirley crying through all of it. Monica Reed, Vanessa's closest friend and colleague, dancing badly in heels she'd announced in advance she should not have worn. It was a beautiful wedding. The photographs were excellent. Vanessa wore both observations the way she wore most compliments about her appearance, gratefully, briefly, and without storing them. The marriage worked. Would you treat them with kindness? 3 years is long enough to know the difference between a marriage that's working and a marriage that's just not yet broken, and theirs was genuinely working. They disagreed about money occasionally, and about Terry's family more than occasionally, but they came back to the center after those conversations, and the center held. He knew how she thought. She knew when not to push. There were evenings when she'd finish a long shift and find him already home. Food ordered, zero expectation of conversation, just the quiet company of someone who understood you'd used up your words for the day. That kind of knowing takes time to build, and she valued it. She also noticed, over those 3 years, a particular quality in the way he talked about her to other people. There was a note in it, not possessiveness, exactly, more like exhibition. Look at what's mine, which she would have found with kindness, which she would have found easier to dismiss if it weren't occasionally accurate. She was, objectively, visible in a way that attracted attention, and Terry moved through the world with a significant amount of his confidence drawing on that visibility. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd filed this observation under manageable and left it there. One evening in the 3rd year, she decided to make them say the thing they'd been circling for 18 months. They were at the dinner table on a Wednesday, which was the night they'd protected from work obligations since year 1. She'd cooked. He'd opened wine. The ordinary comfort of it was so settled that the words came out almost sideways, slipped between the routine of the meal, before either of them could prepare for the weight of them. Maybe we should stop saying someday. Terry set down his fork, looked at her the way he looked at things he was genuinely considering, rather than things he was constructing an answer to. You mean a baby? We've both always said we wanted one. Yeah. So maybe it's time to actually want one. Out loud. With a plan attached. He picked up his wine, held it. Then, yeah. Okay. Let's do that. Vanessa reached across the table and took his hand, and he let her keep it. She felt in that moment the particular warmth of a future that had just been confirmed. Not promised, they both knew better than to traffic in promises about children and timing and the specific shape of what was coming, but confirmed. Set on the ledger. Put in the column of things that were real now rather than theoretical. She trusted him. That was the part she would need to return to later, to study the architecture of it. Not naively, she'd had her doubts in year 1 and some of year 2, had needed the ordinary evidence of consistent behavior to rebuild trust after one argument that had gone wrong in a specific and memorable way. But by year 3, she'd done the work of trusting him and had the evidence to support the conclusion. She trusted him, and he had given her enough consistent, sustained, ordinary evidence to make that trust reasonable. Then came the fire, and reasonable stopped being a category that applied to anything. The evening of the fire started without distinction. Terry went out with colleagues. This happened approximately once a month. Thursday nights, when a particular subset of the Crestline team wrapped a campaign and marked the completion with drinks downtown. Vanessa had no objection. She stayed home. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd learned in the first year that she needed the particular quiet of an empty house to decompress from the particular noise of a day at the counter. And Terry's Thursday nights had evolved from occasional friction into a mutual accommodation that benefited them both. She was asleep by 11. He came in sometime after 1. She heard him in the hallway, a particular quality of movement that told her immediately how the evening had gone. The way you learn to read the acoustics of someone you live with. Shoes on hardwood. Slightly irregular. One hand touching the wall. Not falling. Not incapacitated. Just at the far edge of capable. She'd met him in the hallway. Not as a confrontation, they'd had that one the first time, 18 months ago. And it had produced nothing useful except a mutual understanding that she would not perform concern she didn't feel, and he would not perform remorse he didn't have. This was just making sure he got where he was going. Other room tonight. His voice thick. Yeah. She walked him to the guest room doorway, watched him sit on the edge of the bed with the careful precision of someone managing their own unreliability. He didn't undress. He lay back. She asked if he needed anything. He said to go back to sleep. She went back to the main bedroom. 60 feet of hallway. Turned off the lamp. Was asleep in 10 minutes because she had a 7 a.m. consultation booked, and she treated her sleep the way she treated her skin routine consistently, without negotiation. The smoke woke her at 2:47. Not a dream. Not the slow infiltration of something she'd incorporated into sleep. The immediate, sharp, full consciousness arrival of a smell that the body understands before the mind catches up. She was sitting up before she knew she'd moved. The air in the room had a quality slightly thicker, wrong at the top near the ceiling. She opened the bedroom door and the hallway hit her. Dark and gray and moving, the way smoke moves, not like water, more like intention. Terry. She went to the front door because the hallway was already impassable in the middle. Called 911 from the front yard. Watched the windows and didn't see him come out, because she already knew he wouldn't. Would you treat them with kindness? Because she'd walked him to that room herself and closed the door, and he'd been unconscious when she'd left him, and he slept through everything, and the guest room was at the far end of a hallway that was currently on fire in the middle. She did the math. Went back in. The hospital told her the burns covered the left side of her face, part of her neck, and most of her left arm. 2nd and 3rd degree. The skin graft discussion would come later. For now, wound care, pain management, observation. Her father Daniel sat in the chair by the window, and her mother Shirley held her right hand, and Vanessa looked at the bandages on her left arm and tried to understand what was underneath them. The doctor was careful with his language, not unkind. Precise in the way that serious physicians are precise, which is different from the way nervous people are careful. It's not protection, it's respect. He told her the treatment plan would take years. He said that in the same tone he used to describe the medication schedule, which meant he was telling her fact, not offering opinion. Will I look the way I did before? He said reconstruction had come a long way. He said significant improvement was possible. He said no responsible physician would promise her an exact return to her previous appearance. Vanessa heard all of it, filed it, asked her next question, because there was nothing to do with the information except put it somewhere and keep going. Her father asked about timeline. The doctor said years, not months. Her mother's hand tightened around hers. What she thought, lying in that bed with her left side covered and her right hand occupied by her mother's grip, was not the crisis thought you might expect. It wasn't about Terry or the house or Everly Beauty or the mirror. It was smaller and more precise than any of those things. She thought, I had a 7 a.m. consultation booked, which was absurd, which was the mind doing what it does when the real thing is too large, retreating to the manageable, to the specific and kindness, to the specific and scheduled, because a 7 a.m. consultation was something she understood how to think about, and the rest of it, the years and the bandages, and the face she couldn't currently see, was not yet a thing she understood how to think about at all. Terry came to her room the next morning. He'd been treated and discharged, smoke inhalation, one minor burn on his right hand, scrapes on his back from being dragged across hardwood. The nurse told her before he came in that he'd wept when they explained what she'd done, that he'd needed a moment before he could walk to her door. She watched him stop at the threshold, watched his face work through something complicated and real. The bandages were significant. She knew that. Would you treat them with kindness? She couldn't see herself, but she understood the architecture of the damage, the location, the coverage, the specific vocabulary the doctors had used, and she could extrapolate what it looked like from where he was standing. You went back. His voice was compressed, like something behind it was pushing against the ability to speak at all. You were still inside, Vanessa. He came to the chair beside the bed and sat down hard, not gracefully. I was drunk. You came back into a burning house for me. Yes. He put his head down and his shoulders moved. She watched him cry, with the strange calm of someone who doesn't yet have access to her own grief, the medication, the information, the weight of it all still in transit between knowing and feeling. She felt something, but she felt it from a distance, like watching a weather event through glass. This happened because I was drunk. He looked up, eyes red. I should have been beside you in that room. None of this. The wiring failed, she said. You didn't cause the wiring to fail. Vanessa, you didn't. She meant it. She'd had enough hours in that room before he arrived to decide where the responsibility lived, and she'd decided cleanly. The wiring failed. The fire spread. She made a choice. Don't carry that. He took her right hand in both of his. His hands were warm and familiar, and there was a bandage on the right one. Small and clinical. I'm going to be here for everything that comes next. Every appointment, every procedure, however long it takes. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him, at the specific quality of his certainty, at the way he said it, not performatively, not for the nurse who had stepped out, not constructed. Present. You don't know how hard this might get. Then we'll find out together. She believed him. That's what she would need with kindness. That's what she would need to sit with later. Not that the signs had been there from the beginning, if only she'd looked. She believed him because the evidence of the previous 3 years supported the belief. Because he was crying and holding her hand, and his voice had a specific quality of truth in it. She believed him, and she went into everything that followed, carrying that belief like something she'd packed before she understood what the terrain looked like. The first month, he kept every word of it. Terry Coleman was, in the first 4 weeks after Vanessa's discharge, exactly the man he had presented himself as being in that hospital chair. He drove her to every follow-up. He sat in waiting with kindness. He sat in rooms with the paperwork and the insurance documents and the prescription printouts and the specific medical vocabulary she needed to learn. He changed her bandages with kindness. He changed her bandages correctly, carefully, without flinching, with instructions from the wound care nurse on a laminated sheet he'd apparently studied. He brought her food. He helped her dress when her left arm couldn't manage the mechanics of clothing. He slept on the left side of their bed so she could reach the lamp without crossing her body. None of it looked like obligation. That was the thing. In that first month, it looked exactly like love. Her parents came every day. Her father, Daniel, retired now from 20 years on electrical crews across Nashville and the surrounding counties, good, serious work that had left him with thick hands and a particular way of assessing problems, which was to walk around them first and look before touching anything. Drove her mother Shirley to the apartment in Green Hills, and then stayed because there was always something to carry, always a pharmacy run, always a reason to remain. Monica Reed came the second week and cried before she'd been in the apartment for 90 seconds. She turned away, got herself together, turned back, and pretended the previous 90 seconds hadn't happened, which was so precisely Monica that Vanessa almost laughed, and did laugh eventually. Would you treat them with kindness? Which Monica received with the particular gratitude of someone who'd been trying to make it possible. How's the store? Vanessa asked, because she needed something ordinary. The store is there. It'll keep being there. You are not the store. Tell me anyway, Monica told her. Products and customers, and one woman who'd tried to return something she'd clearly used until it was 3/4 empty. She talked about the store the way she always did, with the combination of affection and exasperation that meant she cared about it. Vanessa listened and felt, For the first time since the hospital, like something in her life was still continuous. Angela Young, her manager, handled the leave paperwork. She called Vanessa on a Tuesday afternoon, said everything that needed to be said about medical leave and temporary disability, and the benefits Vanessa's employment entitled her to, and then said without being asked, without making it a performance, that Vanessa's position would be there. Not forever under any circumstances. That wouldn't have been honest. But until her medical team said she was ready to discuss returning, her position would be there. Vanessa thanked her, and meant it in the specific, careful way that meaningful thanks requires, when you know the difference between the thing you're being offered and the easier alternative. Terry's parents, Pamela and Harold Coleman, did not come. They called Terry. They asked about the situation. They expressed concern through him, which is a particular kind of concern that arrives at the person it claims to be about without actually requiring the concerned party to be in the room with her. Pamela mentioned that they wanted to wait until Vanessa was more settled. Harold suggested that giving the couple space during recovery was respectful. Have they said when they might come? Vanessa asked one evening. They've got a lot going on right now. But they've asked about you. Would you treat them with kindness? She accepted because she didn't have the energy to examine it, and because the first month was otherwise working, and because she'd always known Pamela and Harold Coleman experienced her primarily as a category their son's wife, which was a role with requirements and presentations rather than as a specific person. This had been manageable before the fire. Before, she could perform the role at Tuesday dinners and return home afterward and set it down. She didn't know yet what it meant that the category of their son's wife might require updating. The shift in Terry happened between weeks 4 and 5. She didn't catch it as it was occurring. She courted them with kindness. She caught it in retrospect, the way you understand a weather change, not at the moment the pressure begins to drop, but later, when you're standing in the rain and trying to remember whether there was a specific moment when the sky stopped being merely gray. He still drove her to appointments. But in the waiting room, he was on his phone in a way that was different from before, not the reflexive, distracted checking that everyone does, but sustained, focused, private. Phone face down when she returned. Down before she rounded the corner, she noticed once. Not after she came into view. He still changed her bandages, but he stopped asking how she felt after. The routine remained. The conversation around it evaporated. When she needed something he hadn't planned for, when the specific configuration of pain on a Tuesday afternoon required help she hadn't anticipated needing, and therefore hadn't requested in advance, she saw it cross his face. Not disgust. Not cruelty. Something subtler and more accurate. The expression of a man calculating, then quieting the difference between what he'd agreed to and what was being presented to him. She told herself exhaustion. She told herself grief, his version of it. Quieter than hers, less visible, but possibly present. She told herself the pressure of running a business, while managing her care and financing the rented apartment and absorbing the financial shock of losing the house and all of its contents. Any of these was true. All of them together were more than true. They were sufficient explanation for a man who was trying and was simply stretched thin. And yet, the thing she couldn't explain away was smaller than any of those. It was the not looking. He'd developed, somewhere between week 3 and week 5, a new habit in conversation with her. He looked at her uncovered side, at the right side, at the medication on the table, the IV tubing during home visits, his phone, the window. When the bandage on her face shifted and revealed the left edge of the injured area, the skin that was no longer continuous with itself, that had taken on the layered, uneven quality that burn damage takes on during early healing, he looked away. Every time, not with revulsion. She was watching for revulsion and didn't find it, which might have been better in some way, because revulsion is at least honest. This was the practiced absence of a specific attention, the precise, deliberate redirection of his eyes to literally anything that was not the left side of her face. She told herself guilt. She told herself it reminded him of his own role in the night of the fire, not causality. She'd already addressed that. But something adjacent to it, the memory of his own state that evening, The way her injuries represented the cost of a night he couldn't feel entirely clean about. She gave him the most generous interpretation she could construct, and she filed it, and she kept going. What she did not do was ask him directly. This would have been the right thing to do, and she knew it, and she did not do it. Because she was afraid of the answer. Because she had enough pain without adding the specific pain of a confirmation she couldn't take back. Because she was still carrying that 4-week-old hospital belief, I'm not going anywhere, and she was not ready to set it down. He moved to the second bedroom in week 7. He said he didn't want to disrupt her medication schedule. She woke at 2 a.m. for a specific treatment window, and he had early calls, and it made more sense. All of it was presented not as a decision but as a logistical adjustment, the kind of practical thing that couples in unusual circumstances made all the time. She didn't argue. She wanted to argue. The part of her that understood what was happening, the part she'd been managing and filing and providing generous interpretations for since week 5, that part wanted to say, this is not a logistical adjustment. This is what retreat looks like when it's performing as practicality. But the other part, the part still holding the hospital chair and the words and his hands around hers, that part won. So she said okay, and he carried his pillow down the hall. And would you treat them with kindness? And then it was weeks 9 and 10. And the shape of things was clear enough that she couldn't keep not seeing it, no matter how many files she opened, and how many files she opened, and how many generous interpretations she constructed, and how many times she reminded herself that she was not an easy person to be caring for right now, and that everyone had limits. He left for work before she finished breakfast. He returned after she was in bed. When his phone rang in the evenings, he moved to the other room before he answered. She heard the low, specific murmur of those conversations, through the wall, not the words, just the register. The register was not professional. She'd heard him on professional calls for 3 years. She knew the difference. Who keeps calling? She asked it one night across the kitchen table, which was as close as they were getting to dinners anymore. A client. We're having trouble with a campaign rollout. They call late. They call when something's wrong. She looked at the phone. Face down on the table, he looked at the window. Neither of them said them with kindness. Neither of them said the true thing, which was, I have questions I am afraid to ask you, and you have answers you are unwilling to give me, and the distance between those two facts is filling this apartment every night like smoke, and we are both pretending it isn't. Monica came on a Thursday and found Vanessa eating alone at 6 p.m. with a documentary on in the background because the silence had started to have weight. This isn't how he was with you before. He's running the company. He's paying for all of this. He's not here. He was here at noon, Vanessa. She knew Monica was right. Monica had known them both long enough and clearly enough to say that, and being right about it. But admitting it out loud to Monica, to herself, to the air in the apartment required dismantling something she'd spent 10 weeks carefully constructing. I'm not ready to say what you're about to suggest I say. Monica looked at her, didn't push, stayed for 2 more hours and talked about the store, and did not bring up Terry again that night. This was the specific, practiced love of a woman who understood that timing mattered as much as truth, and that pressing too hard on a closed door doesn't open it, it just teaches the person inside to keep it more firmly shut. 4 months after the fire, Vanessa went in for reconstruction. The procedure had been scheduled for 3 weeks. Skin grafting, donor tissue taken from her hip, placed along sections of her face and arm, where the depth of the burn had prevented normal healing. 7 hours, minimum. 2 sites of recovery, the graft areas and the donor site, which would carry its own separate category of discomfort for weeks. Her parents arrived before 6 a.m. Her father sat in the corner of the pre-op room with his hands on his knees. He'd had the same posture. She recalled suddenly, at her wedding, right before walking her in, would you treat them with kindness? The posture of a man who is holding himself very still because the thing happening is too large for him, and he doesn't know what to do with that. Her mother held her right hand. The left was already occupied with an IV line. Terry arrived at 8:15. The surgery was scheduled for 8:30. He came in and looked at her in the hospital bed with the particular slightly delayed quality of a person who has moved quickly from somewhere else and is recalibrating to the room. He had his phone in his hand. He put it in his jacket pocket when he came through the door, which she registered, which she would return to later. "You made it." She heard the sharpness in her own voice and let it be there. "Of course, I'm here. The surgery's in 15 minutes. I know. I got here as fast as I could." Her father looked at the window, her mother's hand tightened. "Will you stay?" Vanessa asked it plainly. No performance around it. No arrangement of the request to make it easier to say yes to. "When I wake up, will you be here?" Something moved across his face, quick and complicated. "I have a meeting. There's something I can't push today. The surgery is 7 hours. Your parents are here. You won't be alone." "That's not what I asked." He looked at her, and she looked at him, and in the specific silence of what passed between them, she understood something she'd been refusing to understand for 9 weeks. He had constructed a hierarchy in which this surgery, her 7-hour reconstruction, the one they'd been planning for 2 months, the one the doctors had been building toward, since the emergency procedures existed, below something that could not be rescheduled, and he was not going to tell her what that something was. The anesthesiologist came in. Vanessa looked at her parents, looked at her father, who was not looking at Terry, which was deliberate, looked at her mother, who was crying quietly in the way she cried when she had decided not to say anything. She looked at Terry one more time. "Go to your meeting." He said he would come back, when he could. He promised to be there when she woke. He held her right hand for approximately 30 seconds, and then the surgical team needed the space, and he was at the door. His phone was already out before he cleared the threshold. She watched the ceiling of the operating room go white under the lights, and thought, in the last few seconds before the anesthesia arrived, I pulled him out of a burning house by his armpits. I held his weight across 60 feet of burning hallway. I could not lift him, and I did it anyway, and the skin on the left side of my face burned off while I was doing it, and he could not stay 7 hours in a waiting room. She held that thought for as long as she had it, and then the counting started and she let the ceiling be the last thing. Her parents were both there when she woke, her mother in the chair, her father standing. 2 distinct sources of pain now, instead of one, the graft sites and the donor site at her hip, a map of hurt with different textures and different locations, and no hierarchy of importance. "He here?" She heard her own voice, thick from intubation. Her mother and father exchanged the specific, private communication of 2 people who have decided together how to handle a question before it was asked. "Your dad called him." Her mother's voice careful. "He said he'd come when he could." She didn't ask anything else. She looked at the bandages on her left side, refreshed and clean, covering the new skin they'd borrowed from one part of her body to repair another. She thought about the mathematics of that. What had to be given up to reconstruct what was damaged? Terry came that evening. Brief. 20 minutes. He stood at the foot of the bed and told her the surgery had gone. Well, he'd spoken to the surgeon. He had the information. He relayed it accurately. He kept his phone in his pocket for the duration. When she asked if he was staying, he said he'd come back as soon as he could, and that her parents were there and she should rest. He was gone before visiting hours ended. Her father sat with her until 10 p.m., which was when the nurses asked him to go, and even then he stood in the doorway for a moment before he left. Said nothing. Just stood there, with his thick electrician's hands at his sides, looking at his daughter in the hospital bed, with her new bandages and her 2 sites of pain, and the thing in his face was not pity, and not anger, and not grief exactly. It was the particular expression of a man who understands a structural failure when he sees one and is keeping his opinion of it to himself. Because this is not his marriage. Because this is his daughter's decision to make. Because he has watched her make decisions carefully and correctly for 25 years. And he will not override her now. Not even when every fiber of his experienced, practical, structural integrity-trained judgment is telling him that the thing he is looking at is not going to hold. Get some rest, baby girl. His voice was even. We'll be back in the morning. The door closed, the room was quiet. Somewhere down the hall, another patient's monitor was sounding, steady and patient. counting time. Vanessa looked at the ceiling of the recovery room and thought about the apartment in Green Hills, the second bedroom where Terry was sleeping, the phone face down on the kitchen table, the register of those late-night calls through the wall. She had pulled him out of a burning house. She had crossed fire and pain and 60 feet of hallway and held his unconscious weight the whole way. And her face had been burning, and she had not let go. He had left a hospital waiting room for a meeting he wouldn't name. She didn't cry. She thought about it, gave herself the option, considered it seriously, decided it could wait. Not because she wasn't feeling it, because the feeling was so large and so specific and so long in arriving that it seemed like a thing that required the right amount of space, and a recovery room with monitors going and nurses cycling through was not yet that space. She was going to have to do this differently. She understood that now. Whatever she had believed was being held between them, whatever she'd been managing and protecting and providing interpretations for since week 5, she understood that she'd been holding it essentially alone. He had handed her the weight of it gradually, item by item. So slowly she hadn't felt the transfer. The phone calls, the bedroom, the waiting room, the meeting that couldn't be pushed. She would treat them with kindness. She was going to discharge in 4 days into the Green Hills apartment, and she was going to do it differently. She didn't yet know what differently meant. Would you treat them with kindness? But she knew what the past 10 weeks had been, and she knew they could not continue to be that. Because what they had been was her standing in a burning house waiting for a fire that wasn't going to stop. She'd made that mistake once. She understood now what it cost. The recovery room ceiling held no answers. The monitor counted steadily. Vanessa Brooks closed hers and let her body do the work of healing, because that at least was something she knew how to participate in, and because the other work, the harder work, the work that didn't have a clinical protocol, would be waiting for her when she was ready. It always was. She discharged on a Thursday, 4 days after with kindness. 4 days after the surgery, which was the minimum window the attending team would authorize, and she'd pushed for the minimum because the apartment was not where she wanted to be, but the hospital was starting to feel like a place where time went to dissolve. Her father drove. Her mother sat in the back with her. Not because Vanessa needed the physical assistance. She could sit upright. She could manage the seatbelt on the right side. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd graduated from needing help with basic positioning 2 weeks before the surgery, but because Shirley Brooks had made a private calculation about where she needed to be, and that calculation put her in the back seat within arm's reach of her daughter, and nobody argued with Shirley's private calculations. The apartment in Green Hills looked the same, which was the wrong thing to notice, and she noticed it anyway. The same furniture, same light through the kitchen window at that particular angle, same faint smell of the candle she'd burned the week before the surgery, and apparently not finished. Same everything, because 4 days had passed, because the world had not registered her 7 hours on an operating table as a reason to rearrange anything. Terry was there. He'd cleared space in the living room for her to move without catching her left arm on furniture corners. And medical supplies on the kitchen counter, organized, labeled, exactly where they needed to be. He'd thought about it. That was visible. He'd looked at the apartment through the lens of her mobility requirements, and he'd made adjustments, and she registered this as the care it was. She also registered the closedness of the second bedroom door. Her parents stayed until evening. Her father went through the medication schedule with the same methodical attention he'd given electrical diagrams for 20 years, reading it twice, asking one clarifying question, committing it. Her mother reorganized the kitchen without being asked, which was how Shirley Brooks processed distress, and the kitchen was better for it. Terry moved around them with the courtesy of someone who understood the dynamic and had chosen to let it run rather than interrupt it. When her parents left, the apartment was quiet in a different way than it had been in the hospital. Hospital quiet has texture to it, monitoring, movement, the constant low evidence of institutional care. Apartment quiet is just absence. She used her right hand to lower herself to the couch. Terry brought water and the evening medication without being asked. Sat across from her, not beside her. Scroll distance from his phone. How's the pain? Managed. Good. The surgical team said the first week post-discharge is the hardest part of this stage. I know. I was there. He looked at her, a quick, genuine look, something almost like the old attention, and then back to the phone, which he turned face down, before she could see what had pulled it. Here is what she had decided in the recovery room. She would give herself 4 days at home before she made any decisions about the shape of things. 4 days was reasonable. 4 days accounted for the distortion that pain and medication and the specific unreliability of post-surgical emotion could introduce into judgment. She was committed to 4 days of evidence collection before she drew any conclusions. She made it to day 2. The call came at 9:43 p.m. She was in the living room with the lamp on. Would you treat them with kindness? Doing the only thing she could manage for entertainment at that point, which was listening to an audiobook Tusek she wasn't fully tracking, because the donor site at her hip was competing for attention with the graft sites on her face, and arm, and concentration was losing. Terry was in the second bedroom. She could hear, through the closed door, the specific murmur of a voice that was speaking quietly on purpose. Not the professional register. She had established that benchmark already, and she was certain of it. She'd spent 3 years listening to him, work the pacing, the volume, the particular rhythm of business language, the way he talked to clients versus his own team versus vendors. This was none of those. This was slower, warmer, the voice of someone who is saying things they wouldn't repeat in a common room. She sat with the audiobook still playing in her ear and the lamp doing its small, patient work, and she looked at the closed door, and she felt the shape of the thing she'd been refusing to name. Not as a suspicion, as a fact that had been assembled over 10 weeks from sufficient evidence, and was now simply sitting there, waiting for her to stop filing it under possible interpretations. She turned off the audiobook. She did not open the door. What she understood, clearly and completely, in the silence of that apartment at 9:43 on a Thursday night, was that the question of whether she was right was almost secondary. Because even in the most generous version, even if she was wrong about every specific thing, what was true was this. Her husband was in another room, talking in a voice she didn't recognize, and she had come home 4 days after a 7-hour surgery, and she was alone in her living room, and the only treat them with kindness, and the only people who had given her sustained and unconditional presence since the fire were her parents and Monica Reed and her manager. Even if there was nothing behind that door, even if she opened it right now and found him talking to his mother, or a work colleague, or nobody at all, the loneliness of this apartment was real regardless. She'd been carrying it for 10 weeks, and it weighed the same whether she had a name for the source or not. The call ended. The door stayed closed. She took her medication. Would you treat them with kindness? Went to the converted sleeping space Terry had arranged for her in the main bedroom. He'd moved to the second bedroom. She'd kept the main, would you treat them with kindness? This had been an arrangement since week 7, and she lay down with the hip site sending its steady report up through her body, and the ceiling doing what ceilings do, which is hold still while everything else is moving. She thought about the house in Brentwood, the burned house. The land that still existed under what the fire had left, which was apparently how land worked. It persisted through whatever you built on it and whatever you lost. The land was still there. She thought about that. 4 days later, she made Terry's favorite meal. This was the decision she made as the days accumulated and the pain remained, and her parents continued coming, and Monica called every other evening, and Terry continued his patterns, the late returns, the closed door, the phone, and Vanessa continued her calculation, because she had decided to do something that was not an accusation and not a capitulation. Something that created a specific condition. A test without stating it was a test. A question without announcing itself as a question. She cooked, right hand only, which took longer, and cost more in terms of physical patience than she'd accounted for. But she'd made this meal enough times to have it in her hands rather than her head, and her right hand knew what to do. Would you treat them with kindness? Time the left side of her body registered a complaint about the movement. She rested against the counter until it passed, and then she continued. She set the table, his chair and hers. The good plates, not because they were special, but because the ordinary plates were in a lower cabinet she couldn't reach without twisting wrong. She put his glass on the right, because he was right-handed and preferred the reach. She wanted, and she was clear-eyed about this. She was not hiding from herself the reason she'd made this meal in this specific way. She wanted to see what he did when he came home. Not to catch him in a lie. She didn't have the energy for confrontation, and she knew it. She wanted information she hadn't been able to get through the closed doors, and the face-down phone, and the 10 weeks of generous interpretations. She wanted to see what his face did when he walked in and found her standing at the table, his key in the door at 7:15, his shoes on the hardwood, steady and even, none of the slight irregularity of a Thursday night. He came into the living room, registered her, registered the table, the specific sequence of his attentions, her first, then the food, then back to her, then somewhere else. He walked past her to the bedroom without saying hello. So there it was. Not a confrontation, not a refusal, not even unkindness in any performed sense. Just the complete absence of the acknowledgement that any reasonable person would provide in that situation. She'd cooked for him. She was 4 days out of a 7-hour surgery. She was standing at the table she'd set with his glass on the right, and he walked past her to the bedroom. She heard the closet, hangers. Then, the distinct sound of luggage. She walked to the bedroom doorway and held the frame with her right hand. He was folding a shirt into an open suitcase. The phone was face down on the bed, within reach, and even as she watched it vibrated against the comforter. Where are you going? Business trip. When? Tonight. For how long? About a week. The phone vibrated again. He pressed his hand flat against it without picking it up, his eyes on the suitcase. She was aware of the pain in her hip, the graft sites, the bandages on her face. Would you treat them with kindness? She was aware of standing in a doorway in her own apartment, leaning on the frame because her body was still assembling itself after what she'd put it through, asking her husband where he was going, in the specific tone of a woman who already knows the answer is wrong, but needs to hear the wrong things said out loud. The doctor said, I shouldn't be alone this early post-discharge. Call your parents. They've been here every day anyway. You told me in the hospital you would be here. He closed the suitcase with the particular decisiveness of someone who has made a decision before entering the room and is only now executing it. I can't cancel work every time you need something. That's not realistic. Every time. As if she had a history of needing things. As if the previous 10 weeks had been characterized by her excessive demands rather than by her extraordinary restraint in making any demands at all. Would you treat them with kindness? She moved out of the doorway so he could pass, because she was not going to stand in the doorway of her own apartment and physically block the man who had decided to leave. Because dignity was the one thing she'd managed to keep intact through all of this, and she was not sacrificing it tonight. He paused at the dining room table, looked at the food she'd cooked, looked at the plate she'd set on his side, looked at her. I made dinner. She heard the texture of her own voice. Flat, not broken. Flat, I don't have time. He went to the door. The phone vibrated a third time, insistent as a verdict. He pulled the suitcase behind him. At the threshold he turned back, and she thought for 1/2 second that he was going to say something that mattered. Some version of the man she'd married. Some echo of the hospital chair. I'll call when I land. The door closed. The apartment went quiet. She stood at the table she'd set with his glass on the right, and she looked at his untouched plate, and she felt the specific, complete weight of 11 weeks arriving all at once. Not as surprise, as confirmation. The way a diagnosis lands, when you've already understood what your body was telling you, and the doctor is simply assigning it a name. She sat down, because her body needed the chair, not because the chair was any kind of comfort. She looked at the food she'd made with one hand while her surgical sights objected, and she understood that she was done inventing explanations. She called, Shirley. He left. Are you alone? Her mother's voice immediate. Present. No preamble. Yes. We're coming. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Shirley. Brooks had been reading the situation for 11 weeks with the accuracy of a woman who had known her daughter for 25 years, and the calls at 7:40 p.m. that said he left and she was alone said everything her mother needed to hear. Her parents arrived 40 minutes later. Her father came through the door and took one look at the set table with two plates, one untouched, and the particular quality of Vanessa's face, and he said nothing. He walked to the closet and looked at what was still there. He walked to the second bedroom and looked at what was there. He came back. Pack what you need. His voice even. Not angry. Structural. The voice of a man who has identified the load-bearing failure and is now focused exclusively on what to do about it. Vanessa went to the main bedroom and opened her bag. She took the medication, the bandage supplies, the folder of medical records and appointment printouts that she kept organized in a green folder because the doctors had so many pieces of paper and she needed all of them. 2 weeks of clothes. The things that were actually hers, not the decorations, not the wedding photographs on the shelf, not the candle half burned on the kitchen counter. The things her body required. Her mother stood in the doorway and offered to get more. She said, "This is enough." And it was. Because the rest of it, the furniture, the photographs, the carefully selected items that had felt like a home being built, none of that was hers in any way that mattered anymore. The apartment had never been home. She'd been waiting for it to become home, waiting for the person who was supposed to make it that to stop finding reasons to be somewhere else. She was finished waiting. Her father carried her bag. Her mother walked beside her to the car. She did not leave a note. She did not send a message. She did not demand an explanation or an accounting or a confrontation. Because none of those things would give her what she needed, which was simply to stop being in that apartment. The house in Antioch was her parents' house. Would you treat them with kindness? The room they'd prepared for her had her old bookshelf in it and a lamp with better light than the one in the Green Hills apartment, and her mother's particular method of making a bed, which involved an extra blanket folded at the foot because Shirley had once decided this was the correct way and had not revised the opinion in 20 years. She slept. Properly. The first full night of actual sleep since the surgery, which she hadn't realized was the case until she woke at 7 a.m., with light coming through the curtains at the right angle and the particular absence of the thing she'd been carrying. Not peace. Exactly. More like what happens when you set something down that you've been holding so long you forgot you were holding it. Terry came back 7 days later. Would you heard from with kindness. That he'd driven past the Green Hills apartment building, realized she wasn't there, and called Shirley before he called Vanessa. This was characteristic in a way she hadn't previously articulated, but recognized immediately. When things went wrong, Terry Coleman's first instinct was to find the person adjacent to the problem rather than address the problem directly. Her father let him in. Not warmly. Daniel Brooks had not arrived at any version of warmth regarding this situation and probably wouldn't, but with the deliberate courtesy of a man who understood that this was his daughter's marriage and his daughter's conversation to have. Terry's kindness? Terry stood in the living room of the Brooks family home where he had eaten Sunday dinners and helped assemble a ceiling fan and been welcomed with the specific generosity of people who wanted their daughter to be loved well. He stood there and looked at Vanessa on the couch, with her left side still bandaged, and her right hand in her lap, and her parents visible in the kitchen behind her, and his face had the complexity of a man who understands he is being observed, and has not decided yet what to do with that. You moved out. You left me alone 4 days after surgery. I called my parents. I told you to call your parents. She felt it cross her face, something quick and uncontrolled. Almost a laugh. Not a kind one. You told me to call my parents because you were leaving. Not because I needed them. Because you needed an exit. That's not. Anything you need to say can be said with them in the room. He looked past her to where her parents were making no effort to be invisible. Her mother had put down the dish she'd been drying. Her father had not moved at all. Terry's strategy shifted. Vanessa watched it happen in real time, the calculation, the decision, the pivot to the approach he'd presumably prepared before knocking on the door. He dropped his eyes. Would you treat them with kindness? When he raised them again, they had the quality of a man genuinely in the grip of something difficult, and she was no longer certain whether it was performance or truth, which was itself a kind of information. Every time I look at you, he began, his voice lowered and roughened, I remember what you look like in that hospital, what you went through, Because of me. And I don't know how to be around that. She studied him. So you stayed away because of guilt. I don't know how to look at you and not see what I cost you. You managed to look at me for 1 month. He had no answer. She let the silence be there long enough to establish that there wasn't one coming. You want a divorce. She said it not as a question but as an inventory item. Something to be named so it could be assessed. The surprise that crossed his face was real. She could see he'd expected something: tears, argument, a negotiation. Not this. Not the woman on the couch with her hands in her lap saying the hard thing before he'd worked up to saying it. I think it might be best for both of us to let each other go. Start. Don't say it's for me. He looked at the floor, his shoes on her parents' rug. The particular posture of a man who has arrived at a decision and is now experiencing the texture of that decision in a way he hadn't predicted. She was not going to cry in front of him. She had reserved that particular expenditure of herself for people who had earned witnessing it. File for it, and I don't want to see you again after that. He'd expected to manage this conversation. She could see the residue of whatever he'd planned: the careful guilt, the appeal to mercy, possibly some version of "I still care about you" that was supposed to soften what came next. She'd removed the architecture of the plan by naming the destination before he got there. He left without the absolution he'd come for. Her father closed the door behind him and stood in the hallway for a moment. When he came back to the living room, he sat down in the armchair across from Vanessa and folded his hands. You okay? No. She heard her own voice clearly. But I know what I'm doing. He nodded. That was all. Because Daniel Brooks understood the difference between someone who needed counsel and someone who needed to be witnessed, and his daughter had always known which one she was asking for. The legal process of the divorce required her to do things she didn't want to do, which was the nature of legal processes. It required her to sit with documents that described her marriage as a set of assets and obligations. Would you treat them with kindness? It required her to have the conversation she'd been avoiding about what she was entitled to and what she was willing to fight for. Terry's proposal arrived through the attorneys. He would transfer his full share of the Brentwood property, the land, all of it, everything remaining after the fire, to Vanessa's name. In exchange, an uncontested divorce. No ongoing financial support. No contribution to future medical expenses. The surgeries, the therapy, the procedures whose number and cost her medical team had described as significant and multi-year, those became hers alone. He was offering her the burned land, the empty property where their house used to be, and in exchange for that gesture, he was releasing himself from every obligation connected to the wife whose injuries he had, at minimum, passively caused by requiring her to re-enter a burning structure to retrieve him. Her parents read the proposal. Her mother set it down and pressed her lips together. Her father read it twice. You can fight this. His voice measured. His company has been profitable. A good attorney could argue for support during your recovery period. We can, I know. She'd already thought it through, in the specific systematic way she thought through things. But fighting it means keeping him in my life for however long that takes. More depositions, more documents, more Terry. She looked at the page. I can't build anything new while I'm still in a legal structure with him. Vanessa, I know what I'm giving up, Dad. I know it's not a fair exchange. I'm making the calculation that the cost of the fight is higher than the cost of what I lose. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. Are you sure? She looked at the section of the agreement that transferred the Brentwood land into her name. The burned land. The place where a fire had started in the walls and she'd run back in, because someone she loved was still inside. I'm sure I don't want anything that requires me to keep dealing with him. She signed. Terry signed after her. The paperwork moved through the required channels. Some weeks later, the marriage was legally over. She sat with that for one afternoon. Just one. Would you treat them with kindness? She gave herself one afternoon of sitting with the specific particular grief of a marriage that had lasted 3 years and survived things that should have made it stronger, and instead had revealed the exact point where it wasn't built to hold. She cried in her old room, with the bookshelf and the lamp and the extra blanket, and her mother brought tea she didn't ask for, and she drank it anyway. And when the afternoon was over, she went to bed, and the next morning she called the hospital. There was Kudu. She knew how to do work. What happened next she found out through her phone on a Tuesday morning, 8 days after the divorce was finalized, when she was sitting them with kindness. When she was sitting in the Antioch kitchen with her green folder of medical records and a cup of coffee, and the specific determination of someone who has decided to make Tuesday productive. A photograph. Shared publicly. Not sent to her, she'd been blocked on most platforms, which told her he'd anticipated this moment, but Monica had screenshotted it and sent it with a message that said only, "I'm sorry, call me when you're ready." Terry Coleman. Standing with a woman who was not Vanessa, who was in fact approximately 23 years old, and wore the specific, polished composure of someone who spent time in front of cameras, who had the same type of confidence Vanessa recognized from her own years in front of a lens. Would you treat them with kindness? Who was standing in what appeared to be a restaurant in Nashville with Terry's arm at her back, and both of them looking like people who were not beginning something, like people who had already been something for long enough to have a history. 8 days. Vanessa looked at the photograph for a long time, not out of the hope that looking longer would change what it showed. Would you treat them with kindness? She was doing the thing she'd done in the recovery room, the thing she'd been doing throughout the previous 11 weeks, which was looking at information clearly and without the interference of what she wanted it to mean. She counted backward. She was, by nature and by professional training, a person who paid attention to details, skin types, ingredient lists, the specific difference between products whose marketing was nearly identical. She was precise. And so she counted backward through the timeline she could actually verify, the date of the photograph against the month the business trips had begun. The trips against the night she'd first heard that phone call through the closed door. The call against the first week Terry had started coming home after she was asleep. The late nights against the point when he'd moved to the second bedroom. The math arrived at a conclusion she couldn't reject. The divorce had been final for 8 days. Terry Coleman had a public photograph with this woman 8 days after the finalization, which meant not as assumption but as arithmetic that this had not started when the divorce did. This had started earlier. Before the paperwork, before the hospital visit where he'd claimed guilt and asked for separation, before the surgery, possibly before she'd gone to Antioch. He had not left because looking at her injuries reminded him of his own guilt. He had left because he had somewhere else to go. He had constructed the guilt narrative after the destination was already established. He had cried in the hospital chair and said, "I'm not going anywhere," and then spent the subsequent 11 weeks building a route out. She set the phone down on the kitchen table, picked up her coffee, finished it. Would you treat them with kindness? Looked out the window at the street in Antioch where she'd ridden a bike as a child and come home to the specific smell of her mother's cooking and grown up understanding that the people in this house would always be exactly what they presented themselves as. The land was in her name. That was what she had. She was going to sell it. She already knew this, without deliberation, the same way she'd known to go back into the burning house. Not because the knowing was simple, it wasn't, but because some decisions arrive complete rather than assembled. Would you treat them with kindness? The property in Brent had once held the house she and Terry had bought together. It had held the future they'd discussed on a Wednesday evening with his hand in hers. It had held the guest room where he'd slept off his drinking while the wiring failed in the walls. None of those things were there anymore. What remained was land, empty, insured against the damage, appraised at a value that was both less than what the house had been worth and more than nothing. Would you treat them with kindness? She was going to sell it and she was going to use what it gave her to pay for the next stages of treatment without asking Terry Coleman for one more thing for the rest of her life. Her father drove her to the attorney's office to initiate the sale. On the way, he didn't say anything about Terry. He said, "I've been thinking about that wiring. The type of fault that starts in the wall like that, at that hour-old junction box, probably. The previous owners may not have disclosed it." She looked at him. "Are you saying the house insurance might owe us more than they settled?" "I'm saying the attorney should know the details of the fault assessment before the sale closes." He kept his eyes on the road, just so nothing gets left on the table. He was giving her something useful, not comfort, not commentary on the marriage or on Terry or on any of the events that had produced the current situation. Just a practical, structural piece of information from a man who understood how buildings failed and why that mattered to the people inside them. Thanks, Dad. That's what I'm here for. The sale process took several weeks, which required patience she'd gotten good at having. The insurance review her father prompted turned up a discrepancy in the original settlement that the attorney was able to address, which added to the final amount. Not dramatically. Enough. She enrolled in a marketplace health plan through the special enrollment period that applied after the divorce. Would you treat them with kindness? The premiums were higher than the coverage she'd had through Terry's insurance. The deductibles were real, and the out-of-pocket limits were numbers she had to look at carefully before she made appointments. But she had income from the disability benefits for a few more months. She had the land sale proceeds, and she had what remained of the savings account that was in her name alone because she had always, since her first paycheck, kept a savings account that was in her name alone. Her grandmother Shirley Sr. had told her to do this years ago, not as cynicism about marriage, as practicality about personhood. You keep your own account, her grandmother had said, not because you think something will go wrong, but because you are a whole person, and whole people have their own resources. She'd thought about that advice as a daughter's abstraction. She understood it now, as a grandmother's specific foresight. Cumberland Reconstructive Institute was in Midtown, 43 minutes from Antioch, without traffic. Would you treat them with kindness? She made the first appointment on a Thursday morning, the folder of medical records from her emergency treatment and the subsequent grafting already organized in the green folder, because she was always organized even when everything else had stopped being. Dr. Raymond Harris with kindness. Dr. Raymond Harris met with her first. The medical director, thorough, direct, the kind of physician who gave you the information rather than the version of the information he thought you could handle. He reviewed her records. He examined the graft sites and the scarring along her left side with the attention of someone making a real assessment rather than a preliminary one. Dr. Nicholas Allen came in partway through. 30s, board certified in reconstructive surgery, the kind of focus that read as quiet until you understood it was actually precision. He looked at the same sites, looked at the same records, and then sat down with a clipboard and a pen and said, "Tell me what function you've lost and what you want to recover." Not what she wanted to look like, what she wanted to do. She appreciated that distinction enough to decide on the spot that she would tell him the truth. I want to raise my left arm above my shoulder again. I want to turn my head without the skin on my neck pulling. I want to go back to work at a beauty counter and stand there for 8 hours without the left side of my face being the main thing anyone is responding to. Nicholas Allen wrote, "And what are you willing to go through to get there? Whatever's actually going to work." He looked up. "Okay. Not impressed, not performatively respectful. Just assessment received. Let's proceed. Then we need to talk about what's actually going to work." Dr. Harris walked her through the plan. Future procedures would depend on how the current grafted skin healed. The keloid response, which she understood now, from the first procedure, was a factor she had to account for, given her specific physiology would require management throughout. Scar care, physical therapy, staged reconstruction. The timeline, years, not months, which she'd heard before and received differently, now that she had actual money in her account and insurance that was hers. "Can you make me look the way I did before?" she asked, because she needed to know if they would lie to her. Nicholas Allen didn't look uncomfortable. He looked considered. "We can work towards significant improvement. Some areas may come close, others will show the history. No honest surgeon can promise you the past." The past. As if her face before the fire was a destination she could book a return ticket to. "Then what can you promise?" "That we'll tell you the truth at every stage." He held her gaze. "What's improving? What isn't? What the next step is, and what it costs in time and discomfort. You'll make every decision with accurate information." She looked at him for a moment, at the specific quality of his directness, which was different from the directness of people who were performing honesty. This was just the actual thing. "Okay, she said. That's what I need. Her father drove her home. He asked about the appointment with the same interest. He'd asked about the insurance discrepancy, practical, specific, wanting the real information. She gave it to him. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. And then this Dr. Allen. He seemed like he knew what he was doing. Yeah, good. He nodded at the road. You need people who know what they're doing. She thought about that on the drive back to Antioch. About the people who had known what they were doing throughout the previous 5 months. Monica, Angela Young at the store, the attorneys, her father with his electrical knowledge and his practical care, Dr. Harris and Nicholas Allen with their honest assessment and their refusal to offer the comfortable lie. And then she thought about the people who had not known what they were doing, or had known and chosen differently, which was the worse version. Pamela and Harold Coleman, who had asked how things looked rather than how Vanessa was. Terry, who had chosen an exit over a marriage and constructed the exit from pieces of the truth rearranged to protect himself. She was building something, now, slowly, expensively, from what she had rather than what she'd lost. It was not the future she'd planned on the Wednesday evening with his hand in hers. It was not the family they'd discussed. It was not the life that had felt settled. It was hers. That was what it was. Entirely, completely, without negotiation, hers. The physical therapy started the following week. The first session was 22 minutes. She could tell you exactly how long, because she watched the clock on the wall for most of it, tracking the minutes the way you track distance when you're not sure you're going to make it. Her left arm moved through ranges of motion that were simple in principle and brutal in practice. The therapist, a woman named Angela Green, no relation to anyone, just a name, just a person, did not tell her she was doing great when she wasn't. She said, 2 more. Don't hold your breath. She didn't hold her breath. She counted. Coming home to Antioch that evening, she could raise her left arm 3 inches farther than she'd been able to raise it that morning. 3 inches. This was a measurement that in any other context of her life would have been invisible. She noted it in the green folder. Date, range of motion, pain level. She noted it the way she noted everything that mattered, precisely, without editorializing, because the data was more useful than the story she could tell about the data. She was going to build this back, not the same, not the version of it that existed before the fire, before the hallway, before the burned house and the burned marriage and everything that had followed, but something real and hers and built on actual foundations. The past was not a destination, but the future had not been cancelled. She understood this the way she understood formulation, not as feeling, but as chemistry, as the verifiable, testable, evidence-supported truth of what a thing was made of and what it could do. She had enough to start with. She had exactly enough. The nightmares came in 2 varieties, and she learned to tell them apart before she was fully awake. The first kind put her back in the hallway, the specific hallway, the 60 feet she knew by heart, except in the dream it stretched longer than 60 feet, and the smoke was thicker and she could hear Terry in the guest room, but the door kept moving away from her hand. That one she understood. That one had a name and a source, and her therapist at Cumberland had given her tools for it, which she used with the same systematic commitment she brought to the physical therapy exercises. The second kind was worse because it was quieter. In the second kind, she was simply standing in front of a mirror, not doing anything, just standing there, and the mirror was showing her the left side of her face with a clarity that her actual reflection in the Antioch bathroom never managed, because the mind in sleep is precise in the way it withholds mercy. She always woke from the second kind faster. Some information you don't need longer than a second to receive. Progress at Cumberland was real and documented and refused to be fast. Nicholas Allen measured the range of motion in her left arm at every appointment with a goniometer and wrote the numbers in her file without editorializing, which she appreciated more than she would have appreciated encouragement. 8 weeks in, she could raise the arm to 73 degrees. 12 weeks, 81. The numbers moved. Not quickly, but they moved, which was the distinction that mattered between recovery and the alternative. The keloid response along the graft margins required its own management protocol. Steroid injections at the margins, silicone sheeting at night, compression garments that she wore under her clothing during the day, with the pragmatism of someone who had reorganized her entire relationship to discomfort. She'd had a conversation early in treatment with a nurse at Cumberland who explained the physiological reasons her skin responded the way it did, the fibroblast activity, the collagen overproduction, the specific dermal response that her genetics predisposed her toward. She'd listened to all of it and then asked for the clinical literature so she could read it herself, because she wanted to understand her own body rather than simply obey instructions about it. The nurse had pulled it up without comment. Vanessa had read it twice. Understanding the mechanism didn't make the compression garment more comfortable. Would you treat them with kindness? It made wearing it feel like a decision rather than a sentence, which was different enough to matter. The psychological component ran parallel to the physical, as Dr. Harris had described from the first appointment. A therapist named Deborah White worked with Cumberland's patients on the specific category that appearance-changing injuries produced, not general therapy, specialized, with a vocabulary Vanessa had not previously had access to. Body image disruption. Grief for a former self that was still alive. The particular psychological architecture of a face that had been professionally significant and was now changed in ways that the professional world would notice. Deborah White was direct in the way that good therapists are direct, which is to say she did not perform gentleness as a substitute for accuracy. In their third session, she asked Vanessa to describe what she saw when she looked in the mirror. Vanessa described it. Clinically, precisely the way she'd learned to describe things. Deborah White made a note. That's what you see. What do you feel when you see it? I'm telling you what I see. I know. I'm asking something different. Which was the problem, wasn't it? She was very good at describing things. Would you treat them with kindness? She was significantly less practiced at sitting in the feeling of them without converting the feeling into information. She'd been doing the conversion so long at the counter, in the hospital, in the apartment, in the recovery room, that the pathway from feeling to language had become direct and immediate, which looked like emotional articulacy and was actually a form of distance. I feel like I'm looking at evidence, she finally said, like the mirror is showing me proof of something. Proof of what? She thought about it. Genuinely, which was harder than it sounded. That the night happened. That it cost something. That what I did wasn't free. Deborah wrote, and when you say it cost something, what do you feel about the fact that it cost something? She opened her mouth, closed it. Because here was the thing she hadn't said out loud to anyone. Not to her parents, not to Monica, not to the attorneys or the doctors, or any of the people who had been present and kind and useful throughout the previous months. The thing she'd been filing under other categories, because the actual category was too uncomfortable to look at directly. She was angry. Not at Terry, specifically that anger existed, but had a reasonable shape. It was proportionate. She could identify it and set it aside when necessary. The anger she hadn't named was different. It was at the mathematics of the night, at the specific arithmetic that produced the equation. She had chosen to go back in, and the choice had cost her this, and the person she'd chosen it for had not stayed to be worth it. I went back for him, she said, and I would make the same choice. I know I would. But the fact that I would make the same choice doesn't mean I'm not angry that he wasn't worth it. The room was quiet. That's the first entirely true thing you've said in 3 sessions, Deborah White told her. Not unkindly. As a fact. Let's stay with that. Staying with it, as Deborah White defined the practice, meant returning to it weekly and examining it from different angles until it stopped being a wound and started being a history. This took longer than Vanessa wanted and shorter than she'd feared. She was good at work. Emotional work was work too, if you were willing to show up for it with the same consistency you brought to everything else. She practiced standing in front of the bathroom mirror in the Antioch house, starting with 30 seconds and buildings. From there, the way you build any range of motion slowly, with the knowledge that the number would grow if you kept coming back. At 30 seconds, she could do it without turning away, Would you treat them with kindness? At 2 minutes, she could look at the left side without her eyes automatically redirecting. At 5 minutes, she started doing the thing Deborah had suggested, which was looking for what was continuous rather than what was changed. Her eyes. Same. The specific dark shade of them, the shape of the outer corner, the particular attention they conveyed when she was interested in something unchanged. Her mouth on the right side. Same. Her forehead. Her right cheekbone. Her right hand, which had managed everything she'd needed managing for the past several months and had not once failed her. Continuous. That was the word. Not whole, she wasn't performing wholeness, because that wasn't honest, and honesty was the operating system she'd committed to. But continuous. The fire had changed things. It had not erased her. She was still in there, behind the evidence, behind the proof of what the night had cost. She started going outside. Carefully at first, the pharmacy, the grocery store with her mother, short routes that had clear exits and didn't require sustained exposure to strangers. Monica came on weekends and functioned, without naming the function, as a transition object. Someone familiar in an unfamiliar context. They went to lunch once, a place in East Nashville Monica had chosen because she'd been inside it before and knew the light was good and the tables were far enough apart. The hostess looked at Vanessa's left side and looked away and looked back once and then did her job. 3 tables over, a child stared with the unself-conscious completeness that children have before someone teaches them not to. A woman who was presumably the child's mother redirected the child's attention. Vanessa watched all of this from inside the specific stillness she'd been building. She ate her lunch. Fully. Monica talked about the store and a new product line they were getting in from a brand Vanessa had opinions about. And Vanessa expressed those opinions, and it was almost ordinary. Almost the particular ordinary of a Thursday lunch before the fire. Not the same, but adjacent enough to the same that she could see the distance between them, which meant the distance was finite, which meant she was moving. The setback came in month 6 of treatment. She was at Cumberland for a scheduled assessment when Dr. Harris ran the measurements and did not like what he found in one section of the grafted area along her left jawline. The tissue was tighter than the 8-week measurements had predicted. Not dramatically. Enough. The keloid response had been more aggressive in that specific zone than the treatment protocol had accounted for, and it had produced a tension in the reconstructed skin that was affecting both the contour and the range of motion in her neck. He explained this the way he explained everything accurately and completely, with the assessment before the implications, before the options. The current procedural plan needed to be revised. One surgery they'd been targeting for month 8 would need to be delayed. The scar treatment in the jawline zone would need to be extended. The timeline for the subsequent reconstruction was moving. She sat in the examination room and listened to all of it, and when he finished, she looked at the wall for a moment, and then she started to cry. Not quietly. Not the managed, deliberate crying she'd allowed herself in the Antioch bedroom on the afternoon after the divorce. This was the kind that came when the accumulation of a thing finally exceeds the container you've been keeping it in. Would you treat them with kindness? 6 months of appointments and injections and compression garments and physical therapy and mirror practice and nightmares and the green folder and the insurance paperwork and the specific, relentless labor of rebuilding yourself after someone set fire to the structure, 6 months of it arriving all at once through a report about one section of her jawline. I don't know if I can keep doing this. She heard herself say it and meant every word. Every time I think I'm closer, something moves the line. I'm so tired of the line moving. Dr. Harris gave her the space to say it. He did not offer the comfortable lie. He also did not leave the room. Nicholas Allen had been in the consultation during the assessment. He stayed too. He opened the folder, not her green folder, the Cumberland folder, the one with every measurement and procedure note and progress record since her first appointment, and he laid it on the examination table beside her and he pointed, not to the disappointing section, to the numbers from the first appointment. Range of motion on intake, 41 degrees. Current, 84. The neck tightening measured on intake at a constriction index that meant she couldn't fully turn her head to look behind her. Current, The constriction had reduced by more than a third. The scar treat them with kindness. The scar tissue in the superior arm region, which had been the most aggressive site at intake, had responded better than their initial projections and was already at a stage that could support the next procedural layer. This area didn't respond the way we wanted, he said, his finger on the jawline measurement. That changes the plan for this zone. It doesn't change what happened everywhere else. He looked at her, not over her, at the data, but at her, the specific person in the examination room who was tired and was saying so. You're allowed to be exhausted. You've earned that. What you haven't earned is the conclusion that none of this is working. She looked at the numbers. 84 degrees. She'd walked into this building able to raise her arm 41 degrees and couldn't turn her head without pulling, and had stood in front of mirrors for 30 seconds maximum before her eyes refused to stay. What if the next procedure fails too? She wasn't really asking. She was doing the thing her brain did when it was afraid naming the worst version out loud to see if saying it made it smaller. That's a risk, he said, not flinching from it, not performing reassurance. We'll explain every risk before any decision. You choose with full information. You can pause. You can change the sequence. You can tell us at any point that the cost of a specific procedure isn't worth what it offers. A beat. What you can't do is pretend the 43 degrees you've recovered since November don't count. She looked at the folder, at the numbers that were hers, her body's work, her consistency, her hours in therapy, and her minutes in front of mirrors, and her patience with the compression garment and all the ordinary, invisible daily labor that produced those measurements. 43 degrees, which was a number, just a number. But the number had been inside her body for 6 months, and it was real in a way that very few things had been real recently. Revise the plan, she said, when she had enough air to say it. Tell me what the next realistic step is and we'll do that. She had asked for the truth, months ago, when Nicholas Allen first sat down with his clipboard and his pen. She was still asking for it. That was the thing she'd figured out about herself through the previous 6 months. She could handle the truth. Even the hard version. Would you treat them with kindness? Even the version where the timeline moved and the line kept moving, and the person who was supposed to be beside her had signed papers and removed himself from the obligation. She could handle the truth. Would you treat them with kindness? Was the specific weight of being managed, of being given the comfortable approximations instead of the accurate thing. She drove herself home. Her left arm had recovered enough range of motion that she could handle the steering wheel with both hands on most days. And would you treat them with kindness? And today she needed both hands on the wheel because she was still the particular emotional state of someone who had just cried in a doctor's office and needed the physical activity of driving to re-establish her relationship with the world. The route from Midtown to Antioch was 43 minutes without traffic. She knew every light. Her father was in the with kindness. Her father was in the driveway when she pulled in, finishing something under the hood of his truck. He kept the truck in the same condition. He kept everything that mattered to him, attentively and without drama. He looked up when she pulled in and read her immediately, the way he always did, the way she'd stopped being surprised by. She got out and told him the update. Not all of it. The procedural part, the jawline zone, the revised timeline, the additional months of scar treatment. He listened. When she finished, he wiped his hands on the rag he kept tucked in his back pocket. Your grandfather used to say that a job taking longer than you planned just means you found out what was actually there. He put the rag back. Doesn't mean the job's wrong, means you're doing it right. She looked at him, at his thick hands and his careful attention. I'm not sure that's the same situation. Structure's structure. He closed the hood. You keep working the problem. That's all. She kept working the problem. The day Angela Young called about returning to work was a Tuesday in month 7. Vanessa had been at a physical therapy session that morning. 86 degrees now. The 2d6 degrees and of 2 V's, both insufficient and genuinely earned. And she was at the kitchen table with the green folder and the updated insurance paperwork when the call came. Angela did not make it theatrical. She was not given to theatrics, which was one of the reasons Vanessa had always trusted her. She said the consultation role was available. She outlined the accommodation structure they'd discussed in the initial planning conversation months ago. She said the time frame was Vanessa's to determine based on her medical team's clearance and her own readiness, and she was not calling to apply pressure. She was calling because Vanessa deserved to know the door was open and specifically how far open it was. Vanessa sat with the phone after the call and thought about the counter at Everly Beauty, the specific quality of standing behind it, the Saturday customers and the skin-type conversations, and the woman who had wasted $60 on the wrong moisturizer and trusted Vanessa to work backward through her routine and find the error. She thought about her face, about what those customers would see when they looked at her, about the ones who would look with kindness, the ones who would look at the left side and redirect their eyes, the same thing Terry had done, which was now a gesture she recognized with a particular, weary accuracy, and the ones who would look and keep looking and not redirect because they were the other kind. Would you treat them with kindness? The kind hadn't been taught the social mechanics of pretending they didn't see what was in front of them. I don't know how to stand behind that counter with. She'd said it to Monica, who had come on a Thursday evening. She'd said it to Monica and was sitting on the Antioch couch with takeout from a place on Nolensville Road that they'd been going to since before either of them worked at Everly. How am I supposed to advise women about beauty when I'm afraid to let them look at me? Monica put down her container. Your face helped sell campaigns. Her voice careful and exact, choosing words the way Vanessa chose, skincare ingredients, nothing in there that doesn't belong. It was never the reason you were good at your job. It's part of the job. It's part of the job that the company uses for marketing. It's not what made customers come back and ask for you specifically. Monica picked the container back up. Mrs. Patterson used to call ahead to see if you were working that day. You think she was doing that because of your face? Vanessa knew the answer. Mrs. Patterson had combination skin, and a sensitivity to fragrances, and a history of buying products, marketed as solutions to those specific problems that then created new problems. And she'd been cycling with kindness. And she'd been cycling through that loop for years before Vanessa sat her down and explained the cycle and showed her the 3 products that addressed the actual issues rather than the symptoms of the issues. Mrs. Patterson had told 5 people. 2 of those 5 had told 3 people each. This was not how advertising campaigns worked. This was how trust worked. She knew the answer. Would you treat them with kindness? Knowing it and standing behind the counter were 2 different things, and the distance between them was measurable in the specific fear that lived in her chest whenever she thought about a room of people looking at her face and making assessments. She told Dr. Allen about the offer at her next appointment. He was reviewing the compression treatment data, and he listened to her describe the Angela Young conversation and the counter and the customers and the fear without looking up from the file, and then he looked up. What does your therapist say about readiness? That readiness isn't a fixed state you arrive at. It's something you build through doing the thing you're not ready for. Do you believe that? She thought about the mirror. About 30 seconds becoming 2 minutes becoming 5. About the lunch in East Nashville with Monica and the child who stared, and the hostess who redirected her eyes, and Vanessa who stayed in her chair and ate her whole meal. I think I believe it more than I believe the alternative. He wrote something. Then you already know what the next step is. He was right. She had known since the Tuesday call. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd been sitting with the knowing and giving herself time to come around to it, because some decisions deserve the respect of not rushing them. And this one, the first, visible, public, professional step back into the world she'd built before the fire was worth the time she was giving it. She called Angela Young on Friday and said she was ready to discuss a schedule. The first morning back, she stood outside the Everly Beauty entrance on West End Avenue and looked at the store she'd walked into hundreds of times and counted the people moving through the door. Not many. Early on a weekday, the morning crowd was thin. A woman in scrubs, a teenager with headphones, a man who clearly didn't know what he was looking for and would need help when he found someone to ask. Monica found her outside. Didn't say anything. Held the door open. Inside, the familiar came at her all at once, the specific smell of the place, the particular arrangement of light over the displays, the sound of the register and the low background music. and the specific acoustic of a retail space she'd spent 4 years in. Her body knew this room. Even changed as she was, even carrying what she was carrying, her body recognized the space. Monica showed her the updated product wall, 2 new serums, a reformulated foundation line, a moisturizer Vanessa had been waiting for since she saw the pre-launch specifications and talked about it the way she talked about everything work-related, with genuine enthusiasm that was also genuine expertise. Would you treat them with kindness? Vanessa listened and asked questions were good because she still knew how to ask good questions, and her knowledge of formulation was still intact, and the fire had not reached the kindness that understood ingredient interaction and science and skin sense and scent and the specific difference between what a product promised and what it could actually do. She was at the consultation counter when the first customer who really looked at her came in. Not the staring kind, not the redirecting kind. Would you treat them with kindness? The third kind, which Vanessa hadn't fully accounted for, the kind who looked and then looked again and then walked directly to the counter because what they were looking at had decided something for them. She was maybe 60. Would you treat them with kindness? Gray natural reading glasses on a lanyard, the kind of face that had clearly been beautiful in the way that didn't announce itself and had aged into something more interesting. She looked at Vanessa's left side and she said, I heard there was someone at this counter who knew what she was talking about. I've been wasting money in this store for 6 years. Vanessa felt something shift, not dramatically, a small recalibration. Tell me what you've been buying, the woman told her. Vanessa listened fully, the way she'd always listened, without planning the response before the picture was complete. When the woman finished, Vanessa asked 3 clarifying questions about texture and timing, and one about whether she was taking any medications that could affect skin response. The woman blinked. No one's ever asked me that. It matters. Some medications' blood pressure specifically affect how certain ingredients absorb. They were at the counter for 20 minutes. Vanessa recommended 2 products and specifically advised against a third the woman had picked up on her way over, explaining why the active concentration in it was too high for her particular combination of dry skin and rosacea-adjacent redness. You're saving me $38, the woman said. I'm saving you $38 and 3 weeks of irritation, Vanessa told her. Come back in a month and tell me how the first 2 are working. She left. Vanessa stood at the counter and felt not triumph, not relief, something quieter and more durable than either. The particular satisfaction of being useful in the specific way she was built to be useful. She still knew things. The fire had not reached her knowledge. The months in Antioch and the surgeries and the compression garment and the nightmares had not reached her knowledge. It was intact. It was accessible. It was hers. By the end of the shift, her arm ached from the counter and her face, specifically the left side, the grafted zones, was tired in a way she'd learned to distinguish from pain, but which required attention. She told Angela she needed to sit. Angela produced a chair from somewhere without discussion. Monica brought water without being asked. Neither of them treated it as a crisis, which was exactly right. She came back the following week, and the week after. The shifts were short by previous standards, and long by current ones, and each one built on the previous one, the way range of motion built in small, documented increments that didn't feel like progress until you compared the beginning to where you were. The customer who came back was not Mrs. Patterson, who Vanessa had mentally cast in the role because Monica had invoked her name. Would you treat them with kindness? It was the 60-year-old with the reading glasses on the lanyard, who returned 32 days later, with the particular bearing of someone who has successfully completed an assignment and is pleased about it. She asked for Vanessa specifically. The smaller one worked exactly the way you said. I haven't needed the concealer under my eyes in 3 weeks. She set both products on the counter. I'm ready for what comes next. Vanessa felt it move through her, clean and specific. The specific warmth of being right for someone else in the way that produces something they couldn't produce for themselves. Okay, she said, reaching for the green folder she'd started keeping under the counter for notes. Tell me what's changed. The campaign conversation started with Angela, the way most important conversations at Everly Beauty started quietly. at the end of a shift, without preamble. Angela said the brand was developing something new, a campaign featuring women whose confidence had survived things that altered how they looked. Not a disability campaign, she was specific about this. She knew Vanessa would need the specificity. A beauty campaign that told the truth about what beauty looked like after illness, surgery, injury, time. Women who had continued to inhabit their faces after those faces changed. She said she wanted Vanessa. Face and hands. The same categories as before. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a decision being assembled from real components. I need to think about it. Vanessa didn't reach for yes or no. Both were premature. Can I have time? As much as you need. Angela didn't add a deadline. And Vanessa, you don't do this because you think you owe the store something. We're clear. Monica found her later with the proposal materials and did not pretend she hadn't seen them. What's scaring you most? That the camera will show everything I'm still working on accepting. People see you every day now. That's different. Yeah. Monica considered it, but they keep coming back. Which was true. Not in spite of the left side. Not because of it. Because of what she knew and how she silenced and the specific quality of attention she brought to a customer's problem. The face had always been a door, a way in, a first impression. The thing that stopped someone before they heard anything she had to say. The door was different now, but the people who walked through it still found what they came for. She had one condition. If she appeared in the campaign, the scars stayed in the photographs. No editing, no digital softening of the jawline zone, or the arm or the neck. No version of her that looked like the fire hadn't happened. Angela version. Angela accepted, without hesitation. Which told Vanessa something important about the campaign and about the store and about the specific decision she'd been building towards since the Tuesday phone call. The studio looked like every studio she'd ever worked in. Same lights, same positioning marks on the floor, same particular quality of attention from a crew that was good at this and knew it. She stood at her mark, and the photographer gave her the same basic direction she'd been given hundreds of times, and her body knew the geometry of it, how to position her left hand, how to angle toward the light, how much space to give the product. She turned the left side of her face toward the camera without planning to. Just did it. Because the position was right for the shot and she was a professional. And the professional part of her had apparently made a decision her anxious part hadn't finished making yet. The shutter went. She held still. Held the position. Let the shutter go again and again. The photographer looked up from the camera. Not at the screen, at her. That's it, he said. Not performing excitement. Just saying that's the shot. That's exactly it. She held still one more second after he said it. Because she was committing it, not the photograph, which she hadn't seen yet, and wasn't sure she was ready to see, but the moment of making it. Standing in a studio in Nashville with both hands visible, and both sides of her face in the frame and the lights doing their geometric work and her body at its mark, and the shutter having found exactly what it found. She had gone back into a burning house for someone who wasn't worth it, and she was still here, still at her mark, still entirely in the frame. Would you treat them with kindness? The campaign released on a Thursday, which was not a day that had any historical weight except that it was a Thursday. And Thursdays were the day she'd been at the counter since her hours had expanded. Would you treat them with kindness? And she was at the counter when the first customer came in, holding her phone with the campaign image visible on the screen. She held it up. Is this you? Vanessa looked at the image. The first time she'd seen the final photograph, the team had sent proofs for approval, and she'd approved them at her kitchen table with her parents present, which was coincidental, and also not entirely coincidental, because she'd known she might need company. She'd looked at it for 7 minutes before she said yes. 7 minutes with her parents visible in her peripheral vision, not looking at her face, looking at her in the specific way they looked at her when the decision was hers, and they were only present. Yes, she told the customer. That's me. The customer looked at the image and looked at Vanessa and then put the phone down on the counter. I had a double mastectomy 14 months ago. I haven't bought anything beauty-related since then. I walked in here today because of this picture. Vanessa looked at her. Fully. Then, Let's start with what you actually need, she said, and go from there. The messages started the following week. Not to Vanessa, directly to the store's email, to the social channels, addressed to the brand, but clearly for her. Women who recognized something in the photograph that they hadn't been able to see in beauty advertising before. Women who had been hiding. Women who were learning not to. Women who were still in the hiding stage and were writing from inside it, because the image had made the hiding feel less permanent than it had the day before. She read all of them. She didn't read them quickly. She gave each one the time it deserved, which was the time she would have wanted someone to give to the version of herself writing it. She was not, she understood clearly, a symbol. She was not a campaign. Would you treat them with kindness? She was a woman who had walked through a specific fire and come out the other side changed, and who had gone back to work and stood in front of a camera, because both of those things were real things she did, and the camera was honest about it. The messages came from women who recognized the specificity, not the triumph, not the overcoming, but the specific truth of a face that carried its history in it and was still showing up. Nashville Leave at 5 contacted Everly Beauty in month 9. They wanted to do a features, the fire, the recovery, the campaign, what it had meant to the women who wrote in. Vanessa received the request through Angela, who delivered it without editorial comment and made clear that there was no professional expectation attached to the answer. She was not ready. Not for the part that would require her to speak out loud, in front of a camera, about the part of the story that wasn't in the campaign photographs. The photographs showed the evidence. The interview would require her to say the names of things she hadn't yet said in public. The hospital waiting room. The closed door and the phone calls through the wall. The suitcase packed 8 days before the public photograph. She said she needed more time. Nashville Live at 5 said the invitation was open. Nicholas Allen was reviewing her latest measurements at her month 9 appointment when she mentioned the interview. He made a note in her file and continued the assessment. When he finished with the goniometer and the scar measurements and the constriction index, he looked at his clipboard and then looked at her. The jawline zone is responding, he said. The extension we added to the scar treatment is working. We're back on a procedural timeline that makes sense. She let out something that wasn't quite a breath. Yeah? We can talk about the next surgery at your month 12 appointment if the current trend holds. He made another note. The treatment is doing what treatment is supposed to do. You're doing what patients are supposed to do. A beat, something that was almost informal. You're also doing a few things patients aren't required to do, which is your business. She looked at him. He was writing. Not looking at her, at the file, at the documentation that was his professional responsibility. She had been looked at by Nicholas Allen in every state she had been in during the previous 9 months. The first appointment with the green folder and the precise, controlled way of presenting herself. The crying in the examination room in month 6. The sessions where the progress was good and the ones where it wasn't. He had been present for all of it, with a consistency that was professional. And also, in some way she hadn't fully articulated to herself, simply human. He had never once used her vulnerability as access. That was the thing. He had to treat them with kindness. He had information about her that almost no one else had, the medical information, which was intimate in the specific way that bodies are intimate, and he had kept it exactly where it belonged, which was in her file and in the service of her treatment, and nowhere else. He had not softened toward her in the way that would have blurred the boundary. He had been, consistently, and without apparent effort, exactly what she needed him to be in that room. She didn't know what to do with the fact that she'd started noticing the difference between his being present and his being absent. That his appointments were the ones she didn't rearrange when scheduling conflicts arose. That she'd caught herself twice thinking about something she wanted to tell him that had nothing to do with her treatment. She filed it, clearly labeled this time, not under possible interpretations or generous readings. Just, this is a thing that exists, and you are not going to do anything about it. Because he is your doctor and you have enough to be managing without adding the category of your feelings about your doctor to the list. Would you treat them with kindness? She drove home Cumberland in the afternoon light that came off the hills south of the city and turned the late October sky into something almost unreasonably good-looking, and she thought about the interview invitation, about what she would have to say out loud, about the part of the story she'd been protecting. Not for Terry's sake, she did not feel any obligation toward his comfort, but because saying it out loud made it fully real in a way it wasn't quite yet. He had saved himself by leaving. He had found a replacement before he asked for an exit. He had constructed a guilt narrative to cover the timeline and left her with the burned land and the medical bills and the nightmares and the 9 months of work that were producing 86 degrees of motion and a jawline zone that was finally responding, and a return to a counter where customers came back and asked for her by name. She thought about the women who had written to the store, the ones still in the hiding stage. She thought about what it would have meant to her in the Antioch bedroom on the afternoon after the divorce, to read a story that matched the shape of her own. She was not ready for the interview. But readiness, her therapist had established, was not a fixed state you arrived at. It was something you built through doing the thing you weren't ready for. She knew the next step. She'd known it since the Nashville Live at 5 producer's name appeared in Angela's email, the same way she'd known to sell the Brentwood land, the same way she'd known to sign the divorce papers without prolonging the fight. She would do it when it was time, and she would know when it was time because it would feel exactly like this, not comfortable, not fearless, but clear. The way a measurement is clear. The way 43 degrees of recovered range of motion is clear. The way a number in a folder is clear, regardless of how hard it was to get there. She pulled into the driveway in Antioch and her father was on the porch with a cup of coffee, and he raised the cup in the specific minimal greeting that served as their shorthand for, "I see you, I'm here, no performance required." She raised her left arm in return, a small gesture, 86 degrees worth of gesture. He noticed. Of course he noticed.